I led 7 men into St. Teresa's Catholic Basilica in Surabaya during a packed Sunday morning mass, and we smashed every sacred statue we could reach. The Virgin Mary, Saint Joseph, the angels at the altar, swinging iron rods and hammers while 300 worshippers screamed and children cried. But the moment my hammer struck the face of the statue of Jesus Christ above the tabernacle, something happened that stopped every man in our group cold. Something that left the entire congregation silent, and something that put me on my knees, weeping, on a floor covered in broken plaster and shattered stone. Have you ever been so certain you were destroying an idol that you never considered you might be standing in the presence of the living God? My name is Amir Daoud Al-Farouqi. I am 29 years old. And on June 4th, 2022, I led 7 men into St. Teresa's Catholic Basilica in the Genteng district of Surabaya, Indonesia, armed with hammers and iron rods to vandalize every sacred statue in the building during their Sunday worship service. I had no idea that the Jesus whose plaster face I was about to shatter was preparing to reveal himself in a way so powerful that everything I believed about idols, about Christians, and about God himself would be destroyed in a single morning. I grew up in the Ampel district of Surabaya, where the narrow streets smelled of clove cigarettes and fried tempeh, and the call to prayer from Ampel Mosque poured through our windows 5 times a day. My father, Daoud Ibrahim Al-Farouqi, was a respected ustad who taught Islamic jurisprudence at a local pesantren. My mother, Amir, wore the full jilbab and ran a weekly Quran study circle for women. She could recite 15 juz from memory. Our house sat directly behind the mosque compound, so close the walls vibrated when the muezzin called the Fajr prayer. While other boys in the neighborhood chased kites across the rooftops or spent their afternoons at the video game rental shop, I sat on the tiled floor of my father's study, memorizing the Quran. By the age of 15, I had memorized the entire book. The elders at Ampel Mosque would place their hands on my head and say, "Allah has blessed your parents with a special son." I fasted every Ramadan from the age of 11 without complaint and added voluntary fasts on Mondays and Thursdays. My father was explicit about Christians from the time I could understand language. He taught me that they committed shirk, the unforgivable sin, by worshipping a man as God and by bowing before statues made of plaster and stone. He said their churches were houses of idolatry and that the statues they prayed to were an abomination in the eyes of Allah. In our neighborhood, throwing rocks at the small Catholic chapel on the edge of the district was so common that nobody even mentioned it. By the time I was 17, I had joined a youth group connected to the pesantren that focused on opposing Christian expansion in East Java. We protested church building permits. We distributed pamphlets outside Christian schools. We disrupted public Christmas celebrations. I believed every word I spoke and every action I took. By 27, I had a degree in mechanical engineering from the Institut Teknologi 10 November and was working for a manufacturing company in Surabaya's industrial zone. I was engaged to a devout woman named Siti, whose father was a Quran teacher. I had career success, community respect, and absolute certainty in my faith. I had everything. Ask yourself this question. Have you ever built your entire life on something you were so sure of that you never once imagined it could shatter? The trigger came in May of 2022. A friend from the youth group showed me a video on his phone of a Catholic procession through the streets of a neighborhood in South Surabaya. Hundreds of Christians were carrying a large statue of the Virgin Mary through a public road, singing hymns, holding candles, while police escorted them. The sight made my stomach turn. They were parading an idol through the streets of a Muslim-majority city. Children were kneeling on the sidewalk as the statue passed. Elderly women were touching the base and crossing themselves as if the thing were alive. This was not just shirk. This was a public celebration of shirk, done in the open, protected by the authorities, in a nation where 90% of the population was Muslim. I told my friend, someone needs to show them that their statues are empty. Someone needs to walk into one of their churches and smash these things in front of their faces so they can see with their own eyes that nothing happens. No miracles, no protection, just plaster hitting the floor. He looked at me and said, "Then be the one." That night, I could not sleep. My mind was on fire with purpose. I had no idea that the Jesus whose statues I planned to destroy was preparing to reveal himself in a way so devastating that my entire understanding of God and idolatry would be demolished in a single morning. I spent 2 weeks planning. I recruited 7 men: Hassan, a theology student from the Pesantren; Rizki, my cousin who had vandalized the church nativity display; Budi, a childhood friend whose loyalty was total; Wahyu, who had disrupted church services in Malang; Irfan, whose brother had converted to Christianity; Denny, a factory worker with arms thick enough to swing a sledgehammer; and Agus, who had helped shut down a church construction project. I chose St. Teresa's Basilica because it was the largest Catholic church in Surabaya, filled with ornate painted statues, and because their Sunday Mass at 9 drew the biggest crowd. We studied the building: entrances, statue placements, distance between pews and altar. Our plan was simple. We would enter 10 minutes into the Mass, split into pairs, and systematically smash every statue using hammers and iron rods. I felt completely certain Allah had ordained this mission. The night before, I prayed tahajjud at 2 in the morning, pressing my forehead to the tile and asking Allah for courage and strength. But as I prayed, something felt wrong. A heaviness settled on my chest like a stone. Not fear, something deeper, something I could not name. Like the air itself was pushing back against me. I told myself it was Shaitan trying to weaken my resolve. I barely slept. I had no idea that the weight pressing on my chest was not the enemy. It was a warning from the very God whose house I was about to enter. Have you ever been so convinced you were fighting for God that you mistook his warning for the devil's resistance? We arrived at St. Teresa's at 9:10 on a hot June morning. The tropical sun was already fierce, and the air outside the church was thick with humidity. The basilica was beautiful and enormous. White colonial walls, arched stained glass windows, twin bell towers, and a large stone cross above the main entrance. Families in their Sunday clothes were still filing through the doors. An elderly Indonesian woman at the entrance smiled at us and handed each of us a printed program. "Welcome," she said warmly. "God bless you this morning." She did not know. Inside, the basilica was overwhelming. Golden light streamed through stained glass windows and scattered color across the marble floor. Red, blue, gold, green, like fragments of a shattered rainbow. Candles burned in clusters along the walls. The smell of incense hung heavy and sweet, mixed with old wood and flowers arranged around the altar. Statues stood everywhere. The Virgin Mary in a blue robe with her hands open, Saint Joseph holding a lily, 2 angels with spread wings flanking the tabernacle, and above them all, a life-sized painted statue of Jesus Christ on the cross, his head tilted, his hands pierced. The organ played deep, resonant chords. The congregation was seated in long wooden pews. Families, elderly couples, young mothers with babies on their laps, children sitting quietly beside their fathers. A priest in white vestments stood at the altar. There was a peace inside that building that hit me like a physical force. It reminded me uncomfortably of the most sacred nights I had ever experienced in a mosque during Ramadan. I pushed the feeling down and adjusted the backpack on my shoulder. 10 minutes in, I gave the signal. We moved. Hassan and Rizki went left toward the statue of Saint Joseph. Budi and Wahyu went right toward the Virgin Mary. Irfan and Denny moved toward the angels at the altar. Agus followed me down the center aisle toward the crucifix. The hammers came out. The first blow landed on St. Joseph's face with a crack that echoed through the entire basilica like a gunshot. The congregation screamed. A child started crying. Plaster exploded from the statue's cheek and scattered across the pew. Budi swung his iron rod into the Virgin Mary's outstretched hand, and it shattered, fingers flying like white shrapnel across the marble floor. Women were sobbing. Men stood up in the pews but did not charge. The priest raised both hands and shouted, not in anger, but in prayer, "Lord, forgive them. Protect your children. Lord, forgive them." No one fought back. Not one person. Mothers pulled children under the pews. Elderly men knelt where they stood and began praying with their eyes closed. A teenage girl clutched a rosary so tightly her knuckles were white, and she whispered prayers through her tears. Their peace enraged me. I wanted resistance. I wanted proof that they would defend their idols with violence, so I could prove they worshipped stone more than they loved truth. Instead, they gave me love, and I had no weapon against it. An old woman, she must have been 80 years old, stepped into the center aisle directly in front of me, looked up at my face, and said in Indonesian, with a voice that did not tremble, "Jesus loves you, son. He died for your sins just as he died for mine. These statues are not our God, but the God they point to is alive, and he is watching you right now." I pushed past her. I reached the crucifix. I raised my hammer above my head and swung it at the face of the statue of Jesus Christ. That is when it happened. The moment that changed everything I believed about God. The hammer connected with the statue's face. The plaster cracked. And then heat. Not ordinary heat, not the heat of the Surabaya morning, shot through the hammer's handle into my hand. It raced up my arm like liquid fire. It hit my chest and exploded outward through my entire body. My fingers locked. I could not release the hammer. My arm froze mid-swing. Then a light filled the basilica. Not from the windows, not from the chandeliers, from nowhere and everywhere at once. A golden, living light that had weight, that pressed against my skin, that hummed at a frequency I could feel in my teeth and in the marrow of my bones. Then I saw him, not the statue. Him, standing where the broken plaster face had been, but alive, not painted, not carved, alive. His eyes were open and they were looking directly at me with an expression that held two things that should not be able to exist together. Grief so deep it could swallow oceans, and love so complete it could hold the entire universe without dropping a single atom. His mouth did not move. But I heard him, not with my ears, with every cell in my body. He said, "Amir, I am not in the stone. I never was. But I am here. I have always been here, and I have been waiting for you." My knees buckled. The hammer fell from my frozen hand and hit the marble floor with a clang that echoed through the silence. I collapsed. My face hit the cold stone among pieces of broken plaster and shattered fingers from the statues I had just destroyed. And I wept. I wept harder than I had ever wept in my life. Tears poured from my face and pooled on the marble beneath me, and I could not stop them. The weight of what I had done, not just today, but my entire life of hatred, crashed onto me like a building falling. Around me, I heard Hassan sobbing 3 pews back. Rizki was on his knees near the shattered St. Joseph, his hammer abandoned on the floor. Budi had dropped his iron rod and was sitting against the wall with his head in his hands, shaking. Wahyu and Denny stood frozen, tears streaming silently down their faces. Irfan had fled through the side door. Agus was on his knees beside the broken Virgin Mary, whispering words I could not hear. The congregation was perfectly still. Then, slowly, they began to pray, not against us, for us. The people whose statues we had just smashed were on their knees asking God to save us. Minutes could have been hours. The priest walked through the debris. He knelt beside me on the plaster-covered floor. He placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "He loves you, son. He has been waiting for you. Do you understand now? He was never in the stone. He was always in the room." Ask yourself this question. How do you explain seeing the living God standing where you had just smashed his image to pieces? I looked up at the priest through tears so thick I could barely see and whispered, "What do I do? How do I follow him?" The priest helped me to my feet. My legs were shaking. Broken plaster crunched beneath my shoes. Right there, surrounded by the wreckage of every statue we had destroyed, the priest led me in a prayer I repeated through sobs. "Jesus, I have been wrong about you. I called you an idol. I smashed your image with a hammer. but you were standing right behind it, waiting for me. You are not stone. You are alive. Forgive me. Save me. I surrender my life to you completely." The basilica erupted. People who had been hiding under pews moments ago were now on their feet, weeping with joy. Strangers embraced me. An elderly man who had been kneeling in prayer the entire time stood and kissed my forehead. The old woman who had stood in my path in the center aisle took my hands and said, "Welcome home, son." 5 of my 7 men surrendered to Christ that same morning: Hassan, Rizki, Budi, Denny, and Agus. Wahyu gave his life to Jesus 2 weeks later. Only Irfan ran, though he would come to faith 4 months after. 6 months later, I was baptized at St. Teresa's. I chose the name Amir Yohannes. Amir, my birth name meaning prince, and Yohannes, the Indonesian form of John, the disciple Jesus loved, because I wanted to be known as someone defined by love rather than destruction. What happened next changed everything, and the cost was staggering. That is when it happened, the second wave of destruction, this time aimed at me. When I told my father, his face became a mask. Then his voice came out cold and measured, each word a blade. "You are no longer my son. You are dead to us. You have disgraced this family and 1,000 years of our ancestors' faith." My mother wept as though I had physically died. She collapsed against the wall and would not look at me. She blocked my number that same day and sent one final text before she did. It said, "How could you do this to us?" Siti threw her engagement ring at my feet in her father's living room. She called me Murtad and said she would rather never marry than be joined to an apostate. Within 6 weeks, I lost my fiancé, my family, my apartment, and my engineering position. Former friends held funeral prayers for me at Ampel Mosque. But I gained everything that truly matters. I gained Jesus Christ, the living Jesus who stood behind the broken plaster face and looked at me with love I did not deserve. I gained forgiveness for every hammer blow, every insult, every stone I had ever thrown. I gained peace that does not depend on anyone's approval. And I gained the church family at St. Teresa's who embraced me on a floor covered in the rubble of the statues I had just destroyed. That was almost 3 years ago. Today, I work with a ministry reaching Muslims across Indonesia with the gospel, and I carry a specific message that Jesus is not found in a stone or plaster, but that he stands behind every image, every church, every act of worship, alive and waiting. I had no idea my testimony would travel the way it has. Over 110 Muslims have accepted Christ after hearing my story. Many of them were men who, like me, believed that smashing a statue would prove that the Christian God was powerless. They learned what I learned, that you cannot destroy what is alive. 13 months ago, I married a Christian woman named Ruth. She is Javanese, she is gentle and fierce in equal measure, and she understands the cost of faith in Indonesia because her own father was beaten for refusing to remove a cross from his shop. We were married at St. Teresa's Basilica. The same priest officiated. Hassan and Budi stood beside me as groomsmen. The statues had been repaired by then. New plaster, fresh paint, carefully restored by the hands of the same congregation I had terrorized. I stood at the altar where I had swung my hammer, and I placed my hand on the base of the restored crucifix, and I wept with a joy so deep it had no bottom. The first words my daughter Maria heard when she was born 5 months ago were not the Islamic call to prayer, but a lullaby whispered in the name of Jesus. I still send letters to my parents twice a year, once on my mother's birthday and once during Eid. No response has ever come. I pray for them every morning before the sun rises, the same hour I used to pray tahajjud to a God who never showed his face. I do not know if they will ever speak to me again. But the God who stood behind the shattered statue and looked at me with love while plaster dust still hung in the air is powerful enough to reach their hearts too. Look inside your own heart right now. The Muslim man who led 7 men into a basilica with hammers to smash the face of Jesus no longer exists. In his place stands a follower of Christ who helps restore the very things he once destroyed and who would die before raising a hand against the God who waited for him behind broken stone. If he can transform someone like me, someone who swung a hammer at the face of God and was met not with punishment but with love, then he can absolutely transform you, no matter what you have done or where you come from. The same Jesus who stood alive behind a shattered statue and spoke to me through the dust and debris is calling you right now through this very testimony. He is not waiting inside stone. He is not trapped in plaster. He is alive, and he is standing behind every barrier you have built between yourself and him, and he is waiting for you to stop swinging and start listening. Will you let him in? Lay down whatever you have been swinging and meet the God who has been standing behind it all along.